Hello, this is the Sovereign Submission Podcast, and I'm Taylor Elwood. Today, I want to talk about a skill that I think is really important for submissive men to master and work with, and that's learning how to set boundaries. It's learning how to declare what your boundaries are. And it may seem kind of paradoxical in a way when we talk about setting boundaries, because in a very real sense, I think that one of the pushbacks that I would probably get from a submissive man is, well, if I'm supposed to submit to her, am I even allowed to have boundaries? And so I'm going to talk about boundaries both within the context of a DS dynamic, but also within the context of your everyday life, because I think the answer really addresses both things. First and foremost, I think it is absolutely essential that you have a sense of your own boundaries and limits if you're going to be in a DS dynamic. Without having a sense of what those limits are and what the boundaries are, you're not able to submit with confidence. And it's really essential that we understand that about ourselves. Welcome, Sheena, and thank you for confirming on the sound. I appreciate you so much. So what I find is that a lot of times, and I speak to this from both my own experience and from working with other men, a lot of times men don't have good skills when it comes to setting boundaries. And it really makes sense when you think about it. If you've been told all your life that, you're not supposed to, for example, express your emotions, that you're supposed to bury those emotions and push them down, along the way comes a mindset and belief and experience that I'm also not supposed to really set boundaries and limits. I think a lot of men struggle with setting boundaries and limits because it becomes the orientation and the focus kind of comes down to either one of two things. Either I've got to be strong and I've got to be the provider and take care of everything. And that means that I can't have boundaries because I've always got to be out there doing whatever it takes to take care of the family, take care of her, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or the other reason is I feel like I need to please whoever is in my life. I need to make sure that they're happy wife, happy life, all that kind of stuff. And it creates a kind of an experience of, well, I can't really have boundaries then because my focus is on getting someone else's approval. Now, here's the problem with that. In both cases, in both mindsets, what we're really experiencing is a fundamental lack of grounding and cohesive awareness of who we are as men. Who am I as a person? If there are no boundaries and limits in place, your sense of identity is going to be vague and fractious. It is not going to have the singular focus and dedication that it deserves to have. And it's really hard for someone to trust in your submission when your submission isn't grounded in a place of sovereignty and identity. In a very real sense, if I'm in a DS dynamic or really any kind of BDSM scene or anything like that, I have to know what my boundaries are. And if I don't know what my boundaries are, it makes it really hard to even trust me in terms of what occurs. Think about it this way. If you're in a scene and someone is doing something to you and you don't like it, but you're like, okay, I have to go along with it because that's what this person wants. And then afterwards they wrap up and they're like, how'd it go? You say, well, I didn't like it. It made me feel really, really uncomfortable. What you've essentially done is you've established right then and there for that person who was in the scene, like they're going to be like, whoa, wait a minute. You didn't tell me that. You didn't communicate with me. You didn't keep me in the know. And there's a fundamental break of trust. That person can't trust you in a very real sense. And may not even trust themselves because they might be like, well, what didn't I do to read that? And I mean, really, when it comes right down to it in a given scene, it's all about communication. If I'm playing with somebody, I need to be able to communicate with them about what my experience is. at any given time. And I also need to know that they're communicating with me, that they're going to speak up, whether I'm topping or they're topping, or what, like whatever the experience. If she's bottoming in the moment, or she's the one topping, I need to know either way, like what's going on, and so does she, or so does he, or like whatever the dynamic is, or whoever you're with. But the point is that you need to know. And that doesn't happen without having a clear sense of communication in place to establish what your limitations are and what your boundaries are. And I think one of the things that I sometimes see around submission that I'm going to call to my perspective, is a bit unhealthy at times, is when people are kind of like, well, I've submitted and I'm supposed to have no limits. I'm supposed to have no boundaries with the person that I'm submitting to. Boundaries are your, in a very real sense, it's like your establishment of personhood, your establishment of identity, and that may change as time goes on in a DS dynamic. In fact, it inevitably will. But let's be honest here. If you're not able to communicate about where your boundaries and limits are in the moment, it's going to be hard to trust that what you're experiencing at any given time is really real and genuine to what's going on. Whereas if you can say, hey mistress, this is really making me feel deeply uncomfortable, that's valuable information. And if you can say, like, hey, here's a hard limit, I have a no around this, that's valuable information. Now, it may change as time goes on, and it may be something that the two of you work on. I remember listening to a podcast where a guy talked about, like, he submits to his wife, and he was talking about how she really wanted to do some water play with him. So basically she wanted to do like a golden shower and everything, and have him, and that was something where he's like, no, that's like not something I'm going to do. And eventually they did work toward it, and it was eventually something he ended up doing. But it was a journey. It wasn't something that happened right away, and it was something that happened as a result of them continuing to deepen into the dynamic and explore it. Knowing your own sense of boundaries doesn't mean that those boundaries are inflexible. It does mean, though, that you have to be real about them in the moment. Welcome, Aiden. Glad to have you here. So now let's translate this over a little bit, though, to everyday life, because the fact of the matter is, we also need to have a clear sense of boundaries in our everyday life. And something that I, again, sometimes find is that people will assume that someone who is submissive is weak, that person doesn't have a sense of boundaries, or that person is codependent, or things along those lines. And there's a very real difference between someone who is codependent and someone who is submissive. I mean, the way that I kind of look at it is, my submission is a gift for a specific person. It doesn't mean that I'm submissive to everyone around me. Far from it. If anything, like, I have a very clear sense as to who I am in the world, and like how I want to operate, and how I respond to people. And so when I'm interacting with somebody, I do it from a place of sovereignty and awareness. I'm not going to submit to the stranger on the street who walks up and says, you got to do, like, if they even knew I was submissive, like, you have to do what I say because you're submissive. I'd like, fuck no, I don't. I don't have to do what you say. You have to earn that submission. Submission is earned. It is not given automatically. And if it is given automatically, if it's given away too easily, that is a red flag right there. Because what it means is, like, you're not, it's kind of like that sense of like, oh, well, I'm going to automatically defer to this person. But do you know that person? Can you trust that person? Something that I found, I had an experience once around this where like, one of the things that I found is, like, the conversation hadn't really occurred. Like, this person decided that I was submissive and they were going to be in my life and occupy the role of being a dominant. And I ended up resisting through that entire relationship what the person did, because there wasn't a consensual conversation. There wasn't an agreement. And there wasn't a firm establishment of boundaries. And so I ended up inevitably pushing back, and eventually that relationship went away because I realized, because I was just like, no, this isn't what I don't, that person hadn't earned my submission. They made assumptions. And I think it's really important to recognize that and know your sense of worth. There is something really deeply powerful about a man who knows his sense of worth and says, like, look, I'm not going to perform submission for somebody just because they want me to submit. I'm not going to give myself to somebody just because they think they should be able to get me. Sheena says, it's also a turnoff for a Dom to have someone over eager without discernment or communication unless one is into puppy play. Well, and even with puppy play, I would hope that there would be conversations ahead of time, right? If there's not conversations ahead of time, if there isn't a clear establishment of what may happen, I think that is, again, a red flag. There's something very important about recognizing, like, okay, like this is an experience that is desired or an experience that may happen. Have we had the conversation? Have we really established that this is something where each person can feel reasonably safe because they can trust each other and themselves in terms of the communication? If there's not a clear sense of communication in place, that in and of itself is a real problem. Welcome, Ava. Glad to have you here. And this is why, and it comes back again to where I was talking about before, if there is like a sense of codependency and you're like, where you're like, oh, I'm going to roll over and do whatever somebody says to me, that's not submission. That is actually, fundamentally, that is a call on your part to explore your relationship with yourself and where that's coming from and to break that pattern. I think that if I had any piece of advice for somebody who identifies as a submissive person, it would be spend some time really figuring yourself out so that you know where your submission originates from. What is the pattern? And let's be clear, the pattern may originate from some places of trauma, and some of it may be healthy. I mean, speaking as somebody who has had some codependent tendencies in my life, I can safely say that some of my submission, definitely there were definitely flavors that were based in trauma that I had to work through and really get clear on. And this was one of the reasons why learning to set good boundaries became such an important skill. Because I realized that if I was going to submit to someone, I didn't want to submit from a place from trauma, because then at that point, the relationship would become a trauma bond. The dynamic would be a trauma bond. It wouldn't really be based in a place of sovereignty and respect. It wouldn't have the element of trust that is absolutely essential for this kind of dynamic to work. And I think one of the things that does turn off DOMs and turns off mistresses or whatever other term or title we want to use is when a man comes along, or one, but I'm just going to go with man because I work with submissive men for the most part. But when a submissive man comes along and he's like, well, like I'm going to just give myself over to you wholeheartedly and so completely without actually taking the time to check in with myself. And I'm going to do it because I'm hoping to get stuff from you. It's that extraction thing. Like, oh, like I want you to be a kink dispenser. I want you to give me the experiences that I want to have. So sure, I'm going to submit, but it's coming from that place of people pleasing, of approval seeking, of extraction. It's not coming from that place of, I know myself well enough to know what I really want. I know what my needs are. I know how to express these things clearly and cleanly. And I'm willing to develop a relationship here and spend some time developing that and understanding like what we actually can experience together, knowing and trusting in your leadership and your ability to lead me deeper and deeper into the experiences that we both want to have. This is something I'm going to touch on in a later episode, which is like really connecting to the reality of like connecting with somebody where you can like safely say like, this is something that we both want to have and experience. Because this is another disconnect that I think I see a lot in the dynamics, where it's like, well, the submissive man or woman has a need or a want or a desire, and then it's like, well, you have that, and it doesn't match up with the person that you're with. Is there a match? Is there a connection? And I'm not saying, again, that the thing has to happen right away, but there's a very clear sense, like, is there a mutual joining? That's important. We'll talk about that more in another episode. What I want to come back to, those with the sense of boundaries, is take a look in your everyday life and ask yourself, how am I setting boundaries with the people in my life? What am I doing to establish clear, understandable, recognizable patterns where I can say, this is X, this is Y, this is me, knowing myself well enough to know that I can say safely yes or no to something. Our lack of boundaries in our regular life, whether it's at work or friendships or anything else along those lines, will also be mirrored in the dynamic that we're in. So if you don't have good boundaries with other people, you're not going to have good boundaries in that relationship. If you have good boundaries, you're going to know how to establish those same boundaries with somebody else. Now, it is interesting. The other day I had someone who said, I don't like to hear no. And I get that. But she's like, but what I do like to hear is I want to have an explanation. I want to understand, like, what's coming up. And she was talking about this in the context of having an experience with somebody where she is topping them or whatever else. Like, she wants to understand what's really going on. And a lot of times when people think of boundaries, they think of boundaries as saying no. Well, no is one way to express a boundary, but another way to express a boundary is to simply say, here's the experience I'm having. This is pushing me in a direction that I'm not ready for, or this is pushing me into something that I'm feeling deeply uncomfortable with, and I need some space to be with this, instead of being pushed further because I may not be ready for where that's going to take me next. And I think the dom/top's ability to read into that and to see that and to honor what has been expressed is huge. That's where we can trust that person. If I'm with somebody who's kind of like, well, I'm going to just do whatever I want to do with you, and I'm not going to take the time to fully listen to you or receive you or discover you, that's where I get concerned. And the same thing applies in everyday life. If I'm working with somebody and that person's like, well, I'm going to do whatever I want to do, and I'm not going to take any feedback from you, that's a deep concern right there. And the question you kind of have to ask yourself at that point is, why am I putting up with an unhealthy, toxic work situation? A couple of years ago, I was working at a job where it was kind of like that. I had a micromanager where he just insisted on piling more and more work on the team that I was on, having us learn more software, having us do all these other things. And he wouldn't take no for an answer. I ended up leaving that job because I was just kind of like, fundamentally, I was like, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. I didn't like the work environment. I didn't like the way that I was treated. And here's something I'll say, though, in regards to myself. I was at that time still learning a lot of the skills around setting better boundaries and speaking up. So I didn't always speak up and say the things that were on my mind. I was getting better at it. That job proved to be a good testing ground, but I still had a ways to go. I've recently started working, at another job as I'm continuing to work on building my practice and do the other various things that I'm doing. And what's been interesting with that is that I find that it is a lot easier now to set very clear boundaries with that particular job and to be able to speak up. I don't always say yes to everything that's asked of me. I will provide some reasons for why I don't say yes. But I don't always say yes automatically. And if I do say yes, I'm looking at it from a place of, is this honoring myself? Is this honoring my capability of being able to show up and give my best to the work that I'm doing right now? Is this going to honor the patients or customers or whatever else? Those are things that I think of before I say yes, because I want to be able to really give my best. It's the same thing if I was, working with a man, I've got to look at like where my boundaries are. Where am I with all of this? Am I able to set clear boundaries? Am I able to speak up and address things in a good and clean way? And if I'm not, then there's something I need to really look at there. Because if I'm not able to do that, then I'm not giving my best to that person. And I think the same applies with submission. We want to have a clear, distinct experience. We have to be willing to speak up for the edges of that experience, what we can do and what we can't do. And even if you're submissive and you're like, but I want to be able to get to a point where like I have no boundaries or no limits with this person, like they can take me to the deepest level of subspace and everything else, and say that's great. And know yourself well enough to know whether or not you can really handle that right now. And even if you get to a point where you can handle that, can you also recognize that that may not always be the case? Can you recognize that there may be days where you say, like, you wake up or whatever, and you're kind of like, you know what? I need to speak up for my own sovereign sense of self to the person that I'm with and say, like whatever it is that you want right now from me, there's something going on and I need to address and honor that. And I need your support in that. Can you do that? Because if you can't, that's where things get really problematic. That's where it creates resentment. Kind of a good rule, kind of an interesting thing that I think goes along with this is like our relationship with anger. Anger is the expression of feeling like your boundaries have been crossed. Like if you're feeling angry about something, usually it's because you're like, hey, my boundaries have been crossed. We're feeling resentment. Resentment is kind of the unvoiced, unexpressed anger. Some of that is going to be pointed inward at yourself. Like if you've ever felt resentment towards yourself for the situation that you're in, it's probably because you're like, I'm not setting good boundaries with myself. And, a lot of times when we think about boundaries in relationship to other people, but there's also something to be said for having some boundaries with yourself. Having a clear sense of your integrity around like who you are and what is acceptable to you and what isn't. If you find yourself going in and kind of just automatically, doing something because your sense of self is kind of saying, well, this is what I have to do in order to survive, as an example, like pause for a moment and really look at that and ask yourself, why am I saying that? What is it that I'm really setting myself up for here by saying that? What is the self story that I am sharing inwardly that's causing me not to relate to myself and not in a way that is healthy and good and clear? Again, these are all things that we want to be thinking about and really looking at from a place of care and concern for ourselves and for other people. The boundaries that we're able to set with ourselves can be just as important as the boundaries we set with other people. And I'll share a good example of a boundary that I set with myself is that I commit that to exercising pretty much every day. I will give myself the occasional day off. Like yesterday, I gave myself the day off. I could have exercised, and I opted instead to spend some time with my mistress and with our other beloved, playing games and things like that, because that was really important. I mean, part of it was that's what she wanted, but part of it was I also checked in with myself, and I was like, I know I'm going to do this. Like that wasn't the question. It was, what am I willing to say to myself today? Or what am I willing to give to myself today? And I'm like, I've been really pushing it hard lately with my black belt. work and everything else, I'm going to give myself a day off today. I'm going to give myself that day because I'm going to trust that getting that rest in from that will actually be better for me and help me to integrate what I've been training and working on, as opposed to just pushing it and pushing myself maybe further past where I need to be at the moment. And I feel like it was a good call. I woke up today feeling a bit less sore. And I've been feeling a little sore, and that's not like a bad thing, like, because I'm doing some very intensive exercises and work with working on my black belt. But it was important for me to really check in with my body and to honor the boundary and the awareness of my body around like what it needed. So I hope that, like, as you're watching this and taking this in, you're seeing that, boundaries can occur on multiple levels. We can have boundaries with ourselves. We can have boundaries with other people. And yes, we can even have boundaries with the dom, mistress, master, sir, ma'am, whatever we want to call them. We can have boundaries with them as well. And it is actually a healthy thing. I trust a person who has a sense of boundaries in their life far more than somebody who doesn't. The person who doesn't have a clear sense of boundaries is somebody that it tells me that A, they can be walked over, and B, at some point they're going to lash out and react. Because at some point something's going to happen and they're going to be like, oh, now I'm realizing I didn't like this thing. It's like, okay, what's really going on there? Whereas a person who has a clear sense of boundaries and says, no, or says, there's something going on here and I think we need to pause and stop and look at what's going on, that's someone I can trust. And the same thing applies. I want to be able to trust myself. So, when I look at the concept of trust isn't just about trusting other people. It's also about trusting myself. And I'm like, okay, can I trust myself? And if I can trust myself to speak up, to say what's going on with me, to express something, that's a really important thing. I don't think with really any kind of relationship dynamic that it's all or nothing. And sometimes what I see is a tendency to kind of approach relationship dynamics, particularly a power exchange dynamics, as all or nothing. Like you're either fully giving yourself over to this other person so that they have complete control, or if you show any resistance at that point, then you've stepped out of the power exchange. But resistance is there for a reason. Resistance is a signal. It's saying something. If there's an experience of resistance, it's worth spending some time really looking at that and saying, well, checking in with yourself. Well, what's really going on here? What am I feeling resistant about? And the answer isn't always, well, I have to get to a yes for this other person. If that's the default, I'm going to say put on the brakes at that point and really look at even that answer, because that answer is rooted in codependency. It's not always about getting to a yes. It is about getting to the truth, because that's where the intimacy is. That's where the connection is. That's where the relationship happens. Let that land with you for a moment. And just consider that the relationship happens because you've taken the time to be really real with yourself and the other person and the other people in your life. That's one of the things that boundaries brings in for us. Thank you all for being here that were live. For those of you who watch this recorded later on, I'd love to hear your thoughts, any questions you have, and have a wonderful rest of your day.